An orphaned little girl approaches a millionaire at a charity event, begging to be adopted. When he finds her sick and alone in a hospital days later, he realizes he must act now, before it's too late. The cold bit at Livia's skin as she slowly opened her eyes. She was curled up in an alley, her only blanket a ragged piece of fabric that barely covered her legs. She breathed into her hands, trying to warm them, her breath visible in the morning air. The alley was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. She pushed herself up, hugging her thin jacket close, and began walking. Her eyes darted from side to side, searching for anything left behind by the restaurants that lined the street. Trash bins were her usual breakfast stop, and today was no different. She peered into one, lifting a lid slowly. It smelled like old food and rot, but she ignored it. There, near the bottom, she found a piece of bread. Stale, but still food. She grabbed it and ate quickly, chewing with focus. She had learned not to be picky. "Hey, Livia!" a voice called from behind her. Livia turned to see Andre, another kid about her age, running up to her with his hands in his pockets. "Found anything good?" he asked, his voice low as he looked around to make sure no adults were coming. "Just this." Livia showed him the half-eaten piece of bread, and he nodded. "It's all right. Better than nothing." Andre rubbed his nose with his sleeve and gave her a quick smile. The two walked together toward a corner where a few other kids sat, sharing their findings from the morning. They all wore clothes that hung on them like they belonged to someone much bigger. Holes in their shoes, layers of shirts to try and fight off the cold. One of the kids handed Livia a piece of something that looked like a donut. It was hard, but she took it gratefully. "Where'd you sleep last night?" Andre asked, his voice quieter now, as if they were talking about something forbidden. "Near the old cinema," Livia said, breaking off a piece of the donut. "It's warmer there, not much wind." "Did anyone bother you?" He looked at her, concern flickering in his eyes. She shook her head. "No, just cold. But it's fine." They fell into silence, watching as people passed by on the street. Businessmen in suits, women carrying bags of groceries, all moving quickly, not even sparing a glance toward the kids huddled in the corner. Livia's eyes caught something, an official-looking man walking toward them. His uniform was unmistakable. "Run," she whispered sharply to Andre, and they both took off down the alley. They knew the routine. Run, hide, stay out of sight. The last thing they needed was to be taken in by the authorities. They ducked behind a dumpster, catching their breath. "Do you think he saw us?" Andre asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think so. We should be fine," Livia replied, peeking around the edge. The man was gone. She let out a breath, feeling her heart slow down just a little. "We have to be more careful," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "Yeah, we always do," Andre said with a sigh. As the morning passed, Livia found herself near the edge of the main market street. Her eyes caught on something bright and colorful, a poster plastered on the wall of a bakery. She stepped closer, looking at the picture of a smiling man in a suit. It was an ad for a charity event, some sort of fundraiser. The man was famous. Livia had seen him on TV once when she'd snuck a peek inside a shop. "What's that?" Andre came up behind her, looking at the poster. "It's some kind of event," Livia said, her voice distant. "Look, it says he helps children. Maybe he could help us." Andre frowned, shaking his head. "Those people don't help kids like us, Livia. They just want to look good for the cameras." But Livia couldn't take her eyes off the picture. There was something about it, about the way the man smiled, that made her want to believe, even if it was just a little bit. She traced her fingers over the letters, trying to read more. "Maybe," she whispered, mostly to herself. "Maybe he could help." Andre scoffed lightly, but he didn't say anything more. Livia knew he was probably right, but she also knew she didn't have many options left. The memory of the Orphan G manager's cold voice echoed in her head, If she didn't find a family soon, things were going to get a lot worse. Livia shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "I'm going to try," she said suddenly, her voice a little stronger now. "I'm going to that event." "What?" Andre stared at her like she was crazy. "You can't just walk in there." "Why not?" Livia looked at him, her eyes serious. "I have to try something. I can't just stay out here forever." Andre hesitated, then sighed. "You're really going to do it?" Livia nodded. "Yes, I don't have another choice." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded back. "All right, but I'm going with you, just to make sure you don't get into trouble." A small smile touched Livia's lips. "Thanks, Andre." They walked away from the poster, the idea of the event burning in Livia's mind. It was a chance, maybe her only chance. She had to take it. The day of the charity event arrived, and Livia had barely slept the night before. She was nervous, her stomach twisted in knots, but she also felt determined. She stood in front of the broken mirror at the old cinema, trying to smooth down her hair. It was tangled, messy, but she didn't have much to work with. She had washed her face with cold water from a public bathroom earlier that morning. Her reflection showed a small girl with big eyes, filled with something close to hope, but also fear. She took a deep breath. "Let's go," she said to Andre, who was sitting near the entrance, chewing on a stale piece of bread. "Are you sure about this?" Andre asked again, his eyes wide, but there was a hint of resignation there. He knew she wasn't going to change her mind. "Yes." Livia nodded firmly. "I have to try." They made their way to the venue, moving through the crowds of people on the busy streets. The charity event was being held at a big, fancy building downtown, and as they approached, Livia's heart started to pound harder. She could see the people arriving, dressed in suits, fancy dresses, cameras flashing, everyone looking important. "How are we even going to get in?" Andre asked, his voice a low whisper. "I don't know yet," Livia said, her eyes scanning the crowd. She noticed a side entrance where people were bringing in boxes, probably for catering. She grabbed Andre's hand. "There, let's go." They moved quickly, trying not to draw attention. Livia tugged Andre toward the side door, and they slipped in behind a man carrying a tray. Nobody noticed, and they found themselves in a back hallway, away from the main crowd. Andre looked around, eyes wide. "This place is huge." "Shh," Livia said, peeking around the corner. They could hear voices, laughter, the clinking of glasses. She moved forward slowly, pulling Andre along. The hallway opened up to the main room, and Livia saw the crowd, people in beautiful clothes, tables full of food, lights everywhere. "There he is," Andre whispered, pointing. Livia followed his gaze. At the center of the room, surrounded by cameras and people talking to him, was the man from the poster, Marcos. He looked exactly like he did in the picture, tall, confident, smiling, dressed in an expensive suit. Livia swallowed hard. Her mouth felt dry and her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure Andre could hear it. She took a deep breath. "I'm going in," she said. Andre looked at her, alarmed. "Livia, wait, are you sure?" She nodded. "I have to." She stepped out from the hallway, moving toward Marcos. She felt small, invisible, surrounded by people who barely noticed her. But she kept her eyes on him. She walked forward, pushing through the crowd, her heart pounding harder with each step. When she got close enough, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the sleeve of Marcos's suit. He turned, surprised, looking down at her. "Please," Livia said, her voice shaking. "Please, I need your help." Marcos blinked, clearly not expecting to see a child there. He looked at her, confused. What is this?" he asked, glancing around. Livia took a deep breath, her eyes welling up with tears. "Please," she said again, louder this time. "I need a family. I need someone to help me." Please adopt me." The room went silent. All the noise, the laughter, the conversation, it all stopped. People turned to look. Cameras flashed. Livia could feel all their eyes on her, but she kept her focus on Marcos. Her hands were trembling, and she held onto his sleeve tighter. Marcos stared at her, his eyes widening. He seemed at a loss for words. I don't... Livia felt the tears start to spill over. "Please, I don't have anywhere else to go," she whispered. I can't stay out there anymore, please." Marcos looked around, clearly uncomfortable. People were staring, murmuring. He knelt down slightly, trying to lower his voice. "Listen, sweetheart. It's not that simple. I can't just..." "Please," Livia repeated, her voice cracking. She felt her knees go weak, and she knelt in front of him, holding onto his hand now, her tears falling freely. "Please, just help me." There was a long moment of silence. Marcos looked at her, then at the crowd around them. He seemed lost, unsure of what to do. Finally, he put his hand on her shoulder, his face softening just a little. "Okay," he said, his voice gentle. "Okay, listen, I'll see what I can do. I'll help you, all right? But you need to stand up, okay? Let's not do this here." Livia looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears, her breath catching in her throat. She nodded slowly, and Marcos helped her to her feet. She could hear people around them whispering, some snapping pictures. Her face burned, but she didn't care. She held on to Marcos's hand, feeling like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance. "Let's talk later, all right?" Marcos said, his voice still soft. "We'll figure something out. I promise." Livia nodded again, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She let go of his hand slowly, stepping back. She could see Andre at the edge of the room, watching, his face pale. She walked back to him, her legs feeling shaky. "What happened?" Andre asked as soon as she reached him. He said he'd try to help," Livia whispered, her voice barely audible. She felt like she was in a daze, her head spinning. I think he meant it." Andre looked at her, his eyes wide. "Do you really think so?" Livia nodded, though a part of her still wasn't sure. But it was something. It was more than she'd had before. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Let's go," she said. "We shouldn't stay here." They turned and slipped out through the back door, disappearing into the alleyway again. The noise of the event faded behind them as they walked, and Livia felt her heart slowly start to calm. She had done it. She had asked for help. Now all she could do was wait. The following days were hard for Livia. She waited for any sign that Marcos would fulfill his promise. Each time she heard footsteps near her alley, she hoped it would be someone looking for her, telling her that things were about to change. But no one came. The coldness of the city wrapped around her like a blanket that couldn't be shaken off. The promise of warmth and security seemed more distant with each passing hour. Back at the orphanage, things had gotten worse. The manager had seen the coverage of the charity event on TV. He knew what she had done, how she had made a spectacle in front of all those people. Livia hadn't realized it would get her into even more trouble. "You think you're some kind of special case now?" The manager spat, his face twisted in anger. He stood over her, his voice low but filled with contempt. "You embarrassed us all, you stupid girl. Do you think someone like him really cares about you?" Livia said nothing, her eyes fixed on the floor. She could feel the stares of the other children, could hear them whispering. She held her breath, waiting for the manager to finish. "You're nothing but trouble," he continued. "I don't have time to deal with this anymore. You're out." He pointed at the door, his face red. "Find somewhere else to sleep. You're not my problem anymore." Livia felt her stomach twist. She had nowhere else to go. She didn't know what to do, what to say. She wanted to beg, but her throat felt like it was closing up. She turned, grabbing the small backpack that held all of her belongings, and walked out. The cold wind hit her as soon as she stepped outside. She tried not to cry, tried to hold it in, but tears started to well up in her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, trying to stay strong. She had survived on the streets before, and she could do it again. But this time it felt different. She had thought things would change. She had thought maybe there was hope. Now that hope was slipping away. She walked through the streets, her feet moving automatically. She didn't know where she was going, just that she needed to find somewhere to sleep for the night. She found herself near the old cinema again, where she had stayed before. It wasn't much, but it was something. She crawled into a corner, curling up against the cold concrete wall. She pulled her thin blanket around her, trying to stay warm, but the chill seemed to seep into her bones. She tried to sleep, but it was hard. The sounds of the city, the voices of people passing by, the distant roar of cars. It all kept her awake. She felt small, alone, and scared. The image of Marcos's face kept coming back to her, the way he had looked at her, the way he had promised to help. Had he really meant it? Or had it just been words to make her go away? Days passed like this. Each one seemed longer and colder than the last. Livia tried to find food, tried to stay out of sight of the authorities. She ran into Andre a few times. He shared what little food he had with her, but it wasn't enough. She could feel herself getting weaker, her body tired from the constant cold and hunger. One night it started to rain. It was a cold, heavy rain, and Livia had nowhere to go. She tried to find shelter under an awning, but the wind blew the rain sideways, soaking her clothes. She shivered, her teeth chattering. She needed to find somewhere dry, but there was nowhere. She walked, her feet splashing in the puddles, her body trembling uncontrollably. She ended up in a small park, sitting on a bench, her arms wrapped around herself. She felt dizzy, her head heavy. She closed her eyes, trying to pretend she was somewhere else, somewhere warm. But it didn't work. The rain kept coming, and she could feel herself slipping, her body giving in to the exhaustion. It was a passerby who finally noticed her. A woman with an umbrella, her face concerned as she knelt in front of Livia. "Hey, sweetheart, are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. Livia tried to answer, but her voice wouldn't come. She felt herself leaning forward, her body too heavy to hold up anymore. The woman caught her, her voice rising in alarm. "Someone! Call an ambulance!" she shouted. Livia barely heard her. Everything felt distant, like she was underwater. She closed her eyes, the world fading to black. The next thing she knew, she was lying in a bed. It was soft, warmer than anything she had felt in a long time. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the bright lights above her. The smell of antiseptic was sharp in her nose, and she realized she was in a hospital. She tried to sit up, but her body protested. Her chest hurt, and she could feel a tightness when she breathed. A nurse noticed she was awake and came over, her face kind. "Hey there," she said softly. "Take it easy, okay? You're in the hospital. You're safe now." Livia swallowed, her throat dry. How did I get here?" she managed to whisper. "A woman found you in the park," the nurse said. "You were very sick, pneumonia, but you're getting better now. You just need to rest." Livia nodded slightly, closing her eyes. She felt so tired, like she could sleep for days. But there was still a weight in her chest, a fear that wouldn't go away. What would happen now? She had no one. She was alone. The nurse left her, and Livia stared at the ceiling, her mind filled with worry. A few days passed in the hospital. Livia was too weak to get up, her body still fighting the illness. She listened to the doctors talking, heard them mention words like transfer and state care. She knew what that meant. She would be sent to a state institution, one of those places she had heard horror stories about. Cold, strict, with no one who cared. She felt panic rise inside her, but there was nothing she could do. She was trapped. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. She was lying in bed staring out the window when she heard voices in the hallway. One of them sounded familiar, and her heart skipped a beat. She turned her head, and there, standing in the doorway, was Marcos. He looked different than she remembered. Tired, worried, but it was him. "Livia," he said, stepping into the room. His eyes softened when he saw her, and he came closer. "Hey, sweetheart, it's me." Livia felt tears welling up again, but this time they were tears of something like relief. "You came," she whispered. Marcos nodded, sitting down beside her bed. He reached out, taking her hand gently. "I'm sorry it took me so long," he said, his voice quiet. "I should have come sooner, but I'm here now. I'm going to help you. I promise." Livia looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She could see the worry there, but also something else. Determination. She squeezed his hand weakly. "Please, don't leave me," she whispered. Marcos shook his head. "I won't. I promise. I'm going to take care of you, Livia. I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in what felt like forever, Livia allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. She closed her eyes, holding on to Marcos's hand, and for the first time in days she felt herself truly relax. Marcos sat in the hospital room for a long time, holding Livia's small hand. He watched her as she finally fell asleep, her breathing still heavy, but more even than before. The room was quiet, except for the soft beeping of the monitors and the murmur of voices in the hallway. He sighed, rubbing his eyes. He had never imagined he'd be in this position, sitting by the bedside of a little girl who was a complete stranger just a week ago. He stood up, carefully letting go of her hand, and stepped outside into the hallway. He needed air, needed to clear his head. As he walked down the corridor, he could hear the sounds of the hospital, a baby crying somewhere, nurses talking, phones ringing. He reached the exit and pushed through the door, stepping out into the cold afternoon air. Marcos leaned against the wall, pulling out his phone. He stared at it for a moment, then dialed his wife's number. It rang a few times before she picked up. "Marcos?" Her voice came through, cautious. "Hey, Claudia, I'm at the hospital," he said. He paused, taking a deep breath. "With the girl, Livia." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Claudia spoke, her voice tense. "Marcos, you said you were going to think about this. We talked about it. You can't just make these decisions on your own." "I know, Claudia," Marcos replied, his voice strained. "But I couldn't just leave her. She was out there, sick, alone. She has no one." "She's not our responsibility," Claudia said, her voice firm. "Marcos, you can't just take in every person who needs help. It's not that simple. We have our own lives, our own problems." Marcos closed his eyes, pressing his fingers to his temple. "I know it's not simple, I know that. But I can't just walk away from her. I made a promise." "Marcos," Claudia's voice softened, but it was still edged with frustration. "Think about us. Think about what this will mean for our family. We don't even know her. We don't know anything about where she comes from. It's too much." Marcos let out a long breath, his eyes fixed on the ground. "I understand that you're scared. I am too. But I've made up my mind I'm going to help her. I can't turn my back on her." Claudia was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she spoke, her voice strained. "I need some time to think about this, Marcos. I really do." Marcos nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here with Livia." "Goodbye, Marcos," Claudia said, and the line went dead. Marcos stared at his phone, a heavy feeling settling in his chest. He knew this wouldn't be easy. Claudia had always been cautious, always worried about letting new people into their lives. But he couldn't blame her. She was right. It was a huge decision. but he felt it in his gut that he had to do this. He walked back into the hospital, making his way to Livia's room. She was still asleep, her small frame almost lost in the large bed. He pulled a chair over and sat down again, his eyes on her face. He could see how tired she looked, how worn down. She was just a kid who had been through far too much already. The door opened, and a nurse stepped in, giving Marcos a polite smile. "How's she doing?" she asked softly. "She's resting," Marcos replied. "She seems better." The nurse nodded, checking the monitors. "She's improving. The antibiotics are working. She's a tough little girl." Marcos watched as the nurse worked, his mind racing. "What happens next?" he asked. "When she's better?" The nurse looked at him, her expression softening. "Usually in cases like this, the child is transferred to state care. There's a process, but it's not always easy for them." Marcos felt his chest tighten. He knew what that meant. Livia would be sent to a state institution, another place where she would be just another number, another kid with no one to care about her. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let her slip through the cracks again. "Is there a way for me to take her in?" Marcos asked, his voice hesitant. "I mean, temporarily at least." The nurse looked at him, surprised. "Are you family?" Marcos shook his head. "No, I'm not. But I want to help. I want to make sure she's okay." The nurse hesitated, then nodded slowly. "You'd have to speak with social services. It's not easy, but it's possible. If you're serious about this, they'll guide you through the process." Marcos nodded. "I am serious. I want to help her." The nurse gave him a small smile. "I'll let them know. Someone will come by to talk to you." Marcos watched as she left, his heart pounding. He knew this was just the beginning. He had no idea how long the process would take or how difficult it would be. But he was ready to do whatever it took. Later that evening, as Livia slowly woke up, she blinked her eyes open and looked around. When she saw Marcos still sitting there, she gave a small, tired smile. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice raspy. Marcos smiled back. "I told you I wouldn't leave, didn't I?" She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I thought maybe you would change your mind." Marcos shook his head. "No, Livia, I won't change my mind. I'm going to help you. I'm going to make sure you're safe. No more sleeping on the streets. No more being alone." Livia looked at him, her eyes wide. She swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "You really mean it?" Marcos nodded. "I really mean it. We're going to figure this out together." Livia's lips trembled and she wiped at her eyes. She looked at him, her voice trembling. "Thank you. I was so scared." Marcos leaned forward, taking her hand again. "I know, Livia, but you don't have to be scared anymore, I promise." They sat in silence for a long time, the hospital room quiet except for the steady beep of the machines. Marcos felt a strange calm settle over him, a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let Livia down. Not now, not ever. Marcos had spent almost every waking hour at the hospital over the last few days, sitting beside Livia, talking to her, and keeping her company. He didn't mind. It felt like the right thing to do, and it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. He even brought her small treats, apples, juice, a few books to read. She smiled each time he brought something new, and that made it worth every moment. One day, while he was sitting by Livia's bed, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and frowned at the unknown number displayed on the screen. He stepped out of the room to take the call. "Hello?" he said, his voice low, not wanting to disturb the other patients. "Mr. Marcos?" came a woman's voice. "This is Carla from Social Services. I understand you've been staying with Livia, the young girl who was recently admitted to the hospital?" "Yes," Marcos replied, his heart skipping a beat. I've been with her trying to make sure she's okay. Is there any news? Well, Carla hesitated. I understand your intentions, Mr. Marcos, and it's commendable that you want to help. But we need to discuss Livia's situation and the next steps. She's currently under our care, and we need to ensure her safety, which might involve transferring her to a state-run facility soon. Marcos felt a tightening in his chest, the words state-run facility echoing in his ears. I want to help her, he said, his voice firm. I want to take care of her, at least temporarily. I can provide for her, make sure she's safe. Mr. Marcos, Carla replied, her tone a mix of professionalism and sympathy. I understand that you care about her, but the process is not that simple. There are legal procedures, assessments, and paperwork involved. You would need to go through an evaluation, and we need to make sure it's in her best interest. Marcos ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on him. I understand, he said, his voice calmer now. But I want to start that process. Please tell me what I need to do. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Carla spoke again, her voice a little softer. All right, Mr. Marcos. I will set up an appointment with you. We'll need to meet in person to discuss this in more detail. Are you available tomorrow afternoon? Yes, I'll be there, Marcos said quickly. Anything I need to bring? Just yourself for now, Carla said. We'll go over the requirements when we meet. Thank you for your interest in helping Livia. It's rare to see someone so dedicated. Marcos thanked her and ended the call, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready for it. He had to be. He stepped back into the hospital room where Livia was awake, watching him with those big, curious eyes. Who was that? She asked, her voice still raspy but stronger than it had been days ago. Marcos sat down beside her, giving her a reassuring smile. It was someone from social services. They want to meet with me tomorrow to talk about what we can do for you. Livia's eyes widened, and she sat up a little more in her bed. Really? Are they going to take me away? Marcos shook his head quickly, leaning closer. No, Livia. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you're safe, that you stay with me. I promise you that. Livia looked at him, her eyes welling with tears. She swallowed, nodding slowly. Thank you, Marcos, she whispered, her voice cracking. I don't want to go to one of those places. Marcos reached out, taking her hand in his. I know, sweetheart, and I won't let that happen. I'm going to fight for you. You deserve a home, and I'm going to make sure you get one. Livia squeezed his hand tightly, her eyes closing as she let out a long breath. Marcos watched her, feeling the weight of the promise he had just made. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and that there would be challenges, but he was ready to face them. The next afternoon, Marcos found himself sitting in a small, cluttered office at the Social Services Center. Carla, a woman in her 50s with short hair and a kind face, sat across from him, flipping through some papers. So, Mr. Marcos, Carla began, adjusting her glasses, you understand that taking in a child, even temporarily, is a huge responsibility. We need to ensure you're capable of providing for her needs, both emotionally and financially. It's a process that involves background checks, home visits, and assessments. Marcos nodded. I understand, and I'm prepared to go through with it. Livia deserves a chance, and I want to be the one to give that to her. Carla smiled slightly, nodding. It's good to hear you're committed. There are many people who would back out at this stage. She paused, giving him a serious look. You should know that there are risks involved. Livia has been through a lot of trauma. It won't be easy for her to adjust, and it won't be easy for you to help her through it. Are you ready for that? Marcos looked down for a moment, thinking about Livia's face, the way she had looked at him, the fear and hope mixed in her eyes. He looked back up, his gaze steady. "Yes, I'm ready. Whatever it takes." Carla nodded again, her expression softening. "All right then. We'll start with a home visit. I need to see the environment where she'd be staying. After that, we'll conduct interviews and you'll need to complete some paperwork." She handed Marcos a few forms. "These are just the initial documents, basic information, financial stability, background checks." Marcos took the papers, glancing over them, then looked back at Carla. "Thank you for giving me this chance. I promise you I won't let her down." Carla smiled. "I hope so, Mr. Marcos. Livia needs stability more than anything right now. Let's give her that." Marcos returned to the hospital with a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had taken the first step, but there was still so much left to do. He walked into Livia's room, finding her sitting up, her face lighting up when she saw him. "What happened?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Marcos sat down beside her, setting the papers on the small table next to her bed. "I talked to them, and they're going to start the process," he said, smiling. "It's going to take some time, and we have to do a lot of things, but I'm going to make sure you're okay, Livia." Livia looked at the papers, then back at Marcos, her eyes glistening. "You mean I might get to stay with you?" Marcos nodded. "That's the plan, but it's going to take a little while. We need to go step by step." Livia bit her lip, her eyes still wide. "I don't mind. I'll wait. Just, please don't forget about me." Marcos reached over, brushing a strand of her hair away from her face. "I won't, Livia. I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me now." Livia smiled, a real smile, one that made her eyes shine. "Good. I like being stuck with you." Marcos chuckled, leaning back in his chair. He knew they had a long road ahead, but for now that smile was enough. It was worth every fight, every argument, every sleepless night. He was going to make sure Livia had a chance no matter what. The day of the home visit arrived, and Marcos had spent all morning making sure everything was ready. He had cleaned the apartment until it was spotless, even rearranged a few pieces of furniture to make the living room look more open and welcoming. He had even bought a small rug for Livia's room. Well, what would hopefully become her room. Right now it was a spare room, barely decorated, but it was warm and it was ready for her. He walked into the small room, looking around, imagining Livia here. It was just a bed, a dresser, and the new rug, but it felt right. He knew it wasn't much, but it was a start. He hoped it would be enough to convince the social worker that he could provide Livia with what she needed. The doorbell rang, and Marcos took a deep breath, smoothing down his shirt before walking over to open the door. Carla stood there, a clipboard in her hand, her expression neutral but not unfriendly. "Hello, Mr. Marcos," she said, giving him a nod. "I'm here for the scheduled home visit." "Yes, please, come in," Marcos replied, stepping aside to let her enter. He watched as Carla stepped into the living room, her eyes scanning the area. She moved with purpose, her eyes sharp, taking everything in. "Nice place," she said, giving him a small smile. "You've put in some effort to make it comfortable, I see." Marcos nodded. "Yes, I wanted to make sure everything was ready. I've been thinking a lot about how to make Livia feel comfortable here." Carla nodded, making some notes on her clipboard. "That's good to hear. Why don't you show me where Livia would be staying?" Marcos led her to the small room down the hallway, pushing the door open. "This is where I plan to have her stay," he said, gesturing to the room. Carla stepped inside, her eyes taking in the bed, the rug, the dresser. She walked around, nodding slightly as she wrote down a few more notes. "It's simple, but it looks like it would work," Carla said, giving him a look. "Have you thought about what you'd need to add to make this feel more like her space? Personal touches? Things that belong to her?" Marcos nodded. "I have. I want to take her to pick out some things herself once she's well enough to leave the hospital, I think it's important that she has a say in how her room looks." Carla smiled at that, a genuine smile. "That's a good idea. It's important for Livia to feel like she has some control over her environment, especially after everything she's been through." Marcos felt a small surge of hope at her words. He could tell Carla was starting to see that he was serious about this, that he was committed. He followed her back into the living room, where she took a seat on the couch, gesturing for Marcos to sit across from her. "Mr. Marcos," she began, looking at him seriously, "I have to be honest with you. This process is not going to be easy. Taking in a child with trauma is a huge undertaking, and there are many challenges ahead. There will be inspections, interviews, assessments, all to make sure you are prepared and capable of providing the care that Livia needs." Marcos nodded, his expression steady. "I understand that. I know it's not going to be easy, but I'm ready for it. I want to give Livia a home. I want her to have a chance at a normal life." Carla watched him for a moment, then nodded, a slight smile tugging at her lips. "All right, Mr. Marcos. We'll move forward with the next steps. But I need you to be prepared. This is just the beginning. The road ahead will be long, and it will require patience and understanding." Marcos took a deep breath, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Carla. I appreciate that. I promise you, I'm not going to let Livia down." Carla stood up, shaking his hand. "I believe you, Mr. Marcos. I'll be in touch with you about the next steps. In the meantime, continue visiting Livia at the hospital and let her know that things are moving forward." Marcos walked her to the door, his heart lighter than it had been in days. He felt like he was finally making progress, finally doing something that mattered. As he closed the door behind Carla, he looked back at the small room, imagining Livia here, imagining her smile when she realized she had a place to call home. The next day, Marcos arrived at the hospital to visit Livia, carrying a small bag with a few items he thought she might like: a notebook, some colored pencils, a couple of books. When he walked into her room, Livia's face lit up, her eyes widening at the sight of him. "Marcos," she called out, her voice stronger than it had been before. She pushed herself up in bed, smiling brightly. "Hey, sweetheart," Marcos said, setting the bag down on the chair beside her bed. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Livia said, her smile not fading. She looked at the bag curiously. "What's that?" Marcos grinned, reaching into the bag and pulling out the notebook and pencils. "I brought you something. I thought maybe you'd like to draw a little or write something. Whatever you want." Livia's eyes went wide and she reached out, taking the notebook from him. "Really? For me?" Marcos nodded. "All for you. I thought you might like to make some drawings for your new room. We're going to make it feel like it belongs to you." Livia looked down at the notebook, her fingers brushing over the cover. She opened it slowly, her eyes bright with excitement. "Thank you, Marcos," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "No one's ever given me anything like this before." Marcos felt his chest tighten, a lump forming in his throat. He reached out, brushing her hair back gently. "You deserve it, Livia. You deserve so much more. And I promise you, we're going to make sure you get it." Livia nodded, her eyes glistening. She picked up one of the colored pencils, opening the notebook to the first page. She looked at Marcos, her smile softening. "Can I draw something for you?" Marcos smiled. "I'd love that, Livia." He watched as she bent over the notebook, her face focused as she started to draw. The room was quiet, except for the soft scratch of the pencil on the paper. Marcos felt a sense of peace settle over him, watching her, knowing that he was doing the right thing. After a while, Livia looked up, holding out the notebook to him. "Here," she said, her voice a little shy. "I drew this for you." Marcos took the notebook, looking at the drawing. It was a picture of a house, simple but colorful, with flowers and trees around it. In front of the house were two figures, one tall, one small, both smiling. Marcos felt his throat tighten, tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. "It's us," Livia said softly. "That's the house we're going to have. And that's you and me." Marcos looked at her, his heart swelling. He smiled, blinking back the tears. "It's perfect, Livia. Thank you." Livia smiled back, her eyes bright. "Do you really think we'll have a house like that someday?" Marcos nodded, his voice steady. "I know we will. I promise you we're going to have a home. A real one, just like that." Livia looked at the drawing, then back at Marcos, her smile growing. "I can't wait." Marcos reached over, taking her hand in his. "Neither can I, Livia. Neither can I." They sat there together, the hope between them palpable, the promise of a better future finally starting to take shape. Marcos knew there would be challenges ahead, but for now, he focused on this moment. On the small smile on Livia's face and the feeling of her hand in his. It was enough. It was everything. Marcos held the papers tightly in his hand as he walked out of the social services office. His heart was pounding, and he could barely believe it. The paperwork for Livia's temporary guardianship had been approved. There were still many more steps, but for now, she could come home with him. It was official. He was about to become her guardian. He looked down at the documents, his name and Livia's both written there, and a wave of emotion washed over him. Relief, fear, hope, all mixed together in a rush that left him breathless. He knew the journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt real. He was going to give Livia a home, and that meant everything. He headed straight to the hospital, not wanting to waste another moment. He walked down the familiar hallway, his steps quick, his heart racing with anticipation. When he entered Livia's room, she looked up, her eyes widening as she saw him. She smiled, her face lighting up. "Marcos," she said, her voice full of excitement. "Hey, sweetheart," Marcos replied, his smile matching hers. He sat down beside her bed, holding up the papers. "Guess what? I have some good news." Livia looked at the papers, then back at him, her eyes wide. "What is it?" she asked, her voice a mix of hope and fear. Marcos took a deep breath, his voice steady as he spoke. "It's official, Livia. You're coming home with me. I'm your guardian now." Livia stared at him, her mouth opening slightly, her eyes filling with tears. "Really?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Marcos nodded, his own eyes glistening. "Really? We're going to get you out of here, and you're going to come home with me. No more hospitals, no more streets. Just home." Livia's face crumpled, and she let out a small sob, her hands covering her face. Marcos reached out, pulling her into a gentle hug. She clung to him, her small body trembling as she cried. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Thank you, Marcos." Marcos held her tightly, his own throat tight with emotion. "You're welcome, Livia. You deserve this. You deserve so much more." They stayed like that for a long moment, the weight of everything settling between them. Finally, Livia pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked at Marcos, her eyes still shining. "When can we go?" she asked, her voice small but filled with hope. Marcos smiled. "As soon as the doctor says you're ready. It won't be long now. And when we get home, we can start making your room just the way you want it." Livia nodded, her smile growing. "I can't wait." The day Livia was discharged from the hospital, Marcos was there early, making sure everything was ready. He helped her into the clothes he had brought, a warm sweater, soft pants, new shoes that actually fit her. She looked different already, healthier, her cheeks a little fuller, her eyes brighter. She held onto his arm as they walked out of the hospital, her steps slow but steady. Marcos watched her, his heart swelling with pride. She was stronger than anyone he had ever met, and now, finally, she was getting the chance she deserved. When they reached his car, Livia hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking to him, a hint of uncertainty there. "It's okay," Marco said softly, opening the door for her. "You're safe now, Livia." She nodded, her hand gripping the door handle tightly before she climbed in. Marcos got in on the other side, starting the engine. As they drove away, Livia stared out the window, her eyes wide, taking in everything. The city passed by, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't look so threatening. When they reached the apartment, Marcos helped Livia out of the car, leading her to the building. She looked up at it, her eyes wide again. It wasn't a fancy building, just a simple, modest apartment complex. But to Livia, it was everything. "This is home?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Marcos nodded, smiling. "Yes, this is home." He led her inside, up the stairs, and stopped in front of his door. He pushed it open, stepping aside to let her enter first. Livia walked in slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The living room was simple, just a couch, a small TV, a few shelves with books and pictures. But it was warm, and it smelled like the candles Marcos had lit earlier, trying to make it feel more welcoming. Livia turned to look at him, her eyes wide. It's really nice." Marcos smiled, closing the door behind them. "I'm glad you think so. Come on, let me show you your room." He led her down the hallway to the small room at the end. He pushed open the door, watching as Livia stepped inside. Her eyes went to the bed, the rug, the dresser. She walked over to the bed, running her fingers over the blanket. "It's mine?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "All yours," Marcos said, leaning against the doorframe. "And we can make it however you want. We can paint the walls, get new curtains, whatever you like." Livia looked at him, her eyes shining again. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Marcos replied, his voice soft. "This is your home now. You can do whatever makes you happy." Livia smiled, sitting down on the bed. She looked around, her fingers brushing over the notebook and pencils he had brought her from the hospital. She opened the notebook, flipping to the drawing she had made for him. "Do you think we could put this up on the wall?" she asked, looking up at him. Marcos smiled, nodding. "Of course. We'll frame it and hang it right here." Livia's smile grew, and she hugged the notebook to her chest. "Thank you, Marcos," she whispered. "I never thought I'd have a room like this. I never thought I'd have a home." Marcos felt his throat tighten, and he walked over, sitting beside her on the bed. He put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You deserve this, Livia, and I promise you, I'm going to make sure you always have a place to call home. No more streets, no more fear, just family." Livia leaned against him, her eyes closing for a moment. "Family," she repeated softly, her voice filled with hope. Marcos nodded, his heart full. "Yes, sweetheart. Family." That evening, Marcos made dinner, something simple, pasta and a salad. He wasn't much of a cook, but Livia didn't seem to mind. She sat at the small kitchen table watching him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Do you like cooking?" she asked, her voice soft. Marcos chuckled, shaking his head. "Not really, but I'm learning. I figured I should probably get better at it now." Livia smiled, resting her chin on her hand. "I think it's nice. I want to learn too someday." Marcos nodded. "We can learn together. Maybe we'll get some cookbooks, try some new recipes. How does that sound?" Livia's eyes lit up. "Really? I'd like that." They ate together at the table, the apartment filled with the sound of their quiet conversation, the clinking of forks on plates. For the first time in a long time, Livia felt full, not just her stomach, but her heart too. She looked at Marcos, and she knew that this was what she had always dreamed of. When dinner was done, Marcos showed her how to wash the dishes, and they did it together, Livia standing on a small stool so she could reach the sink. She laughed when Marcos splashed her with water, and he laughed too. the sound echoing through the apartment. Later, as the evening came to a close, Marcos helped Livia get settled in her room. He pulled the blankets up around her, tucking her in, and sat on the edge of the bed. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his eyes searching her face. Livia nodded, her eyes closing as she smiled. "I'm more than okay. I'm happy." Marcos felt his heart swell, and he leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Good night, Livia. Sweet dreams." "Good night, Marcos," she whispered, her voice sleepy. "Thank you for everything." Marcos turned off the light, leaving the door open just a crack. He stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the soft sound of her breathing. He knew there would be challenges ahead, that there would be difficult days, but for now, this was enough. Livia was safe, and she was home, and that was all that mattered. The next morning, Marcos woke up early, the sunlight just beginning to filter through the curtains. He stretched, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Today was a new beginning, not just for Livia, but for him too. He got up, dressed quietly, and made his way to the kitchen. He wanted to have breakfast ready by the time Livia woke up. He opened the refrigerator, looking at what they had: eggs, milk, some bread. He decided on scrambled eggs and toast, something simple but filling. He cracked the eggs into a bowl, the sound echoing softly in the quiet apartment. He was halfway through making breakfast when he heard a small voice behind him. "Marcos?" Livia's voice was groggy, still heavy with sleep. Marcos turned around, smiling at her. She was standing in the doorway, her hair sticking up in all directions, her eyes squinting against the light. She was still in her pajamas, the ones he had bought her on their way home from the hospital, soft, blue, with tiny stars. "Hey, sweetheart," Marcos said, motioning her to come over. "Did you sleep well?" Livia nodded, rubbing her eyes. "Yeah, it was really warm. I liked it." Marcos's heart swelled, and he nodded back. "I'm glad. How about some breakfast? I'm making scrambled eggs. Do you like eggs?" Livia walked over, peeking into the pan. She nodded again. "I like them. I used to have them sometimes when I was really little." "Well, today you can have as much as you want," Marcos said, turning back to the stove. He noticed how she lingered close, as if not quite sure what to do or where to be. He pulled a stool closer to the counter. "Why don't you sit here and keep me company while I finish up? Then we can eat together." Livia climbed up on the stool, her eyes following Marcos's every movement as he cooked. She seemed fascinated by the simple task of making breakfast, her eyes widening each time he added something to the pan or flipped the toast. "Do you think one day I could learn to cook like you?" Livia asked, her voice soft, hesitant. Marcos looked over at her, smiling. "Of course you can. We'll practice together. We can make breakfast, lunch, dinner, whatever you want. I'm not the best cook, but I think we'll figure it out." Livia's lips turned up into a smile, and she nodded, her eyes brightening. "Okay, I'd like that." They ate breakfast together at the small table, the sunlight spilling into the room, warming the space. Marcos watched Livia as she took small bites of her eggs, her eyes scanning the room as if she was still trying to take everything in. She looked at the books on the shelf, the pictures of Marcos and his friends, the little knickknacks he had collected over the years. "Do you read a lot?" Livia asked, her eyes lingering on the shelf filled with books. "Sometimes," Marcos replied, nodding. "I like to read when I have the time." "Why? Do you like books?" Livia looked down at her plate, her cheeks flushing a little. "I like them. I just never had many. I used to borrow some from the library, but it's been a while." Marcos's heart tightened at her words, and he gave her a soft smile. "Well, you can read any of the books here anytime you want, and we can go to the library together, pick out some new ones. How does that sound?" Livia looked up, her eyes shining. "Really? I'd love that. Marcos nodded. Absolutely. We'll go soon. Maybe tomorrow if you feel up to it. Later that morning, Marcos decided it was time for Livia to see a bit more of the neighborhood. She had been cooped up in hospitals and alleys for far too long. He wanted her to know that this was her home now, and she could feel safe walking around. He grabbed their coats and turned to Livia. How about we take a little walk, he asked. I'll show you around the neighborhood, and maybe we can stop by the park. Livia hesitated for a moment, looking uncertain. Marcos could see the hesitation in her eyes, the fear that maybe this was too good to be true. He stepped closer, giving her an encouraging smile. We can come back anytime you want, okay? You're in control here. If you feel uncomfortable, we turn around and come straight home. Livia bit her lip, then nodded. Okay, I think I'd like to go. They walked side by side, Marcos keeping a slow pace so Livia wouldn't feel rushed. She stayed close to him, her eyes darting around as they walked, as if she was trying to memorize every detail. Marcos pointed out different places, the grocery store, the bakery, the little coffee shop where he sometimes stopped for a cup of coffee. Livia nodded, listening intently, her eyes wide. When they reached the park, Marcos watched as Livia's face lit up. The park wasn't big, just a small playground with a few swings and a slide, but it seemed to be enough to spark something inside her. Do you want to play? Marcos asked gently. Livia looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. Can I? Marcos smiled. Of course. This is your park too now, Livia. She looked at the swings, then back at Marcos, and slowly walked over to one of them. She sat down, her hands gripping the chains, her feet just barely brushing the ground. Marcos walked over and gave her a gentle push, and she started to swing, her smile growing with each movement. She laughed, really laughed, and the sound filled the cold morning air, echoing off the nearby buildings. It was a sound Marcos hadn't realized he'd been waiting for. He stood there, watching her, his heart swelling. This was what it was all about. This was why he had fought so hard for her. After a while, Livia's laughter faded into soft giggles, and she looked back at Marcos, her eyes shining. Thank you for bringing me here, she said, her voice full of emotion. Marcos smiled, nodding. Thank you for coming with me. I'm glad you're here, Livia. She looked down, her fingers brushing over the swing chains. I used to watch other kids play at the park, but I never got to. I always thought maybe one day, but then... Her voice trailed off, and Marcos felt his chest tighten. He stepped closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. You can come here every day if you want to now. You never have to just watch again, okay? You're free to be here as much as you want. Livia looked up at him, her eyes glistening, and nodded. Okay, I'd like that. They spent a little more time at the park, Livia trying out the slide, running in the open grass, her face filled with pure joy. Marcos watched her, his heart swelling. This was what she had missed out on for so long, just being a kid, having fun, being carefree. And now, finally, she was getting a chance to have it. That evening, after they returned home, Marcos noticed a change in Livia. She seemed more relaxed, more comfortable. She wasn't clinging to the edges of the room like she had been when she first arrived. Instead, she was in the living room, sitting on the couch with one of the books she had taken from the shelf. Marcos watched her for a moment, then walked over, sitting down beside her. What are you reading? He asked, his voice soft. Livia looked up, a small smile playing on her lips. It's about a boy who goes on adventures. I like it. Marcos smiled, nodding. I used to read that one when I was your age. It's a good one. Lots of adventures. Livia nodded, her eyes brightening. Do you think we could read it together? Maybe you could read some of it to me? Marcos felt his heart swell, and he nodded. I'd love that, Livia. How about we read a little bit before bed? Livia's smile grew, and she nodded eagerly. Yes, please. That night, Marcos sat on the edge of Livia's bed, the book open in his lap. Livia was tucked under her blankets, her eyes wide as she listened to him read. His voice filled the room, painting pictures of far-off lands and brave heroes. Livia's eyes slowly grew heavy, and eventually, she drifted off, her breathing even, her face relaxed. Marcos closed the book gently, setting it on the nightstand. He looked at Livia, his heart swelling with love and hope. This was what she needed: stability, safety, someone to be there for her, day in and day out. He knew they still had a long way to go, but for now, this was enough. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Good night, Livia," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "Sweet dreams, sweetheart." He stood up, leaving the door open just a crack, and walked out into the hallway. He knew that the road ahead would be full of challenges. There would be moments of doubt, of fear, of hardship. But there would also be moments like this, small, precious moments that made it all worth it. He was ready for whatever came next, as long as he had Livia by his side. The days began to blur together in the best way possible. Livia was getting into a routine, waking up, having breakfast with Marcos, taking a walk in the neighborhood, sometimes going to the park. Each day brought a little more light into her eyes, a little more confidence to her steps. She was getting used to her new life, and she seemed to be allowing herself to finally believe that this was real. One afternoon, Marcos decided it was time for something special. It had been weeks since Livia had come to live with him, and they had been taking it day by day, working on building trust, creating a sense of normalcy. But now, Marcos wanted to do something that would show her that her life was more than just survival, that there was joy too. "Livia," Marcos called, finding her in her room, sitting on the floor with her colored pencils spread out around her. She was drawing, her face relaxed and focused. She looked up at him, her eyes curious. "Yes?" "How about we go for a little adventure today?" Marcos asked, smiling at her. Livia raised an eyebrow, her curiosity growing. "What kind of adventure?" Marcos grinned. "How about a picnic? Just the two of us at the park. It's a nice day, and I thought we could take a break from being inside. What do you say?" Livia's eyes widened, her smile spreading across her face. "Really? I'd love that." Marcos nodded, feeling his own excitement grow. "All right then. Let's get ready. We'll pack some sandwiches, some snacks, and we'll head out." Livia jumped up from the floor, her drawing forgotten. She helped Marcos in the kitchen, her hands small but steady, as she spread peanut butter on slices of bread. Marcos watched her, smiling as she worked with care, her face lighting up each time she completed something. Together they packed a basket, sandwiches, apples, some juice boxes, and even a small bar of chocolate. Marcos had bought it a few days ago, thinking it might be a nice treat for Livia. When she saw it, her eyes widened, and she looked up at him. "Chocolate?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Marcos nodded. "I thought it would be a nice surprise. We can share it at the park." Livia smiled, her face practically glowing. "Thank you, Marcos." Once they were ready, they headed out, Livia carrying the blanket while Marcos carried the basket. The sun was warm on their faces, and there was a gentle breeze in the air. It was one of those perfect afternoons that seemed to promise good things. They walked to the park, Livia's steps light, almost bouncing as they went. She looked around, taking in the people, the trees, the laughter of other children playing nearby. Marcos could see how much this meant to her, to be out here, not as someone hiding in the shadows, but as a part of it all. When they reached a quiet spot near the trees, Marcos spread out the blanket, and they sat down. Livia looked around, her eyes wide, her smile soft. "This is perfect," she said quietly, her voice filled with awe. "I never thought I'd get to do something like this." Marcos nodded, his own heart full. You deserve this, Livia. You deserve all of it. They unpacked the basket, and Livia helped set out the sandwiches, her face lighting up when she saw the juice boxes. They ate together, the sun warming their skin, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze filling the quiet spaces between their words. Livia laughed at a squirrel that came close, trying to sniff out their food, and Marcos found himself laughing too. After they finished eating, Livia leaned back, looking up at the sky. I always wanted to have a picnic, she said softly. I used to see people doing it in the parks, and I always thought it looked so nice. I wanted to feel normal, I guess. Marcos looked at her, his heart aching for all the things she had missed. You are normal, Livia. You always were. You just didn't have the right chance before. But now, you can do anything you want. Livia turned her head, her eyes meeting his. Really? Marcos nodded, his voice steady. Really, this is just the beginning. You have a whole future ahead of you and it's going to be bright. I promise you that. Livia smiled, a small, hopeful smile, and nodded. Okay. Marcos reached into the basket, pulling out the bar of chocolate. He unwrapped it, breaking off a piece and handing it to Livia. She took it, her eyes wide, and looked at it for a moment before taking a small bite. Her eyes closed, and she let out a small, happy sigh. It's so good, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Marcos smiled, breaking off a piece for himself. I'm glad you like it. They sat there, sharing the chocolate, the warmth of the afternoon wrapping around them like a gentle embrace. Marcos watched as Livia's face relaxed, as she leaned back on her hands, her eyes closing, her face turned up to the sun. Marcos? She said after a while, her voice soft. Yes, Livia, Marcos replied, looking at her. Do you think I could go to school someday? She asked, her voice hesitant, almost afraid of the answer. Marcos felt his heart swell and he nodded. Of course you can, Livia. We're going to make sure of it. You're going to go to school, make friends, learn all kinds of things. Anything you want to do, we'll figure it out together. Livia looked at him, her eyes wide, her face filled with wonder. I'd like that, she whispered. I want to learn. I want to be something. You already are something, Livia, Marcos said, his voice thick with emotion. You're brave and you're kind and you're stronger than anyone I know, but I can't wait to see what else you become. Livia smiled, her eyes glistening. She looked back up at the sky, her shoulders relaxing. Thank you, she said softly, for everything, for giving me a chance. Marcos swallowed hard, his own eyes stinging. You don't have to thank me, Livia. You deserve it, and I'm the lucky one to have you here with me. They stayed at the park until the sun began to set, the sky turning shades of orange and pink. Livia ran around for a while, her laughter echoing through the park, her feet kicking up leaves as she went. Marcos watched her, his heart full. This was what he had wanted for her, a chance to be a kid, to be free, to be happy. As the sun dipped lower, they packed up their things, Livia carrying the blanket again while Marcos carried the basket. They walked home slowly, the light fading, the city coming to life with the glow of streetlights. Livia stayed close to Marcos, her hand occasionally brushing against his arm, her face relaxed and peaceful. When they reached the apartment, Marcos unlocked the door, letting Livia go in first. She looked around, smiling as she walked to her room, setting the blanket on her bed. Today was the best day, she said, turning to Marcos, her eyes shining. I never thought I could have a day like this. Marcos smiled, his chest tight with emotion. There are going to be a lot more days like this, Livia. This is just the start. Livia nodded, her smile growing. I can't wait. Marcos watched her for a moment, then walked over, pulling her into a hug. She wrapped her arms around him, holding on tightly. I love you, Livia, Marcos whispered, his voice thick. I'm so proud of you, and I'm so glad you're here." Livia looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "I love you too, Marcos. You're my family." Marcos felt his heart swell and he nodded, his eyes glistening. "Yes, sweetheart, we're family, and nothing will ever change that." They stayed like that for a long moment, the warmth between them filling the room, the promise of a future together, full of love and hope. That night, as Livia settled into her bed, Marcos sat beside her, reading a few pages from their book. Her eyes grew heavy, and eventually she drifted off, her face relaxed, her breathing even. Marcos watched her for a moment, his heart full. He knew there would still be challenges ahead, but he also knew that they would face them together. He had found his purpose, and Livia had found her home. And that, more than anything, was all that mattered. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Sweet dreams, Livia," he whispered. "Welcome home." He turned off the light, leaving the door open just a crack, and walked into the hallway, a smile on his face. This was the beginning of something beautiful, a new life, a new family, and he couldn't wait to see what tomorrow would bring.